A few years ago, I moved to a small rural community. I grew up in a fairly large city and was never one for that kind of environment. It was just too loud, claustrophobic, and chaotic all the time. As soon as I was old enough and could finally afford it on my own, I packed my bags and got the hell out of there. The town I moved to is incredibly small, but the surrounding forests and mountains are absolutely breathtaking, no matter what season of the year it is. It honestly blows my mind that this little place isn't more of a tourist trap during the summer and fall. To give you an idea of how small we're talking, the town doesn't have much. A few local diners, a couple of bars, a gas station that doubles as a repair shop, one small supermarket, a tiny police station, and that's basically it. Heck, the closest Walmart is like an hour's drive away. My little paradise is completely off the grid, and honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way. I've been living here for over 3 years now, and other than one horrible, unforgettable day, it's been great. But as I learned the hard way, even the most peaceful, picture-perfect towns can hide some incredibly dark secrets. When I first moved to town, I managed to get a part-time job at the local supermarket. Back in my hometown, I used to manage a major grocery store chain, so I had a ton of experience. My shift started first thing in the morning. I'd go in around 5 a.m., unload the delivery trucks and stock the shelves. The owner actually offered me a full-time management position, but I turned him down. I only wanted part-time work, basically just to have a little extra spending money and an excuse to get out of the house. See, I also have a remote job that I do online, which makes up the bulk of my income. I wanted as much free time as I could possibly afford so I could hike and fish as much as humanly possible. There are so many endless woodlands in this area that it would probably take me a lifetime to hike them all. But of course, I was more than up for the challenge. So every single day off, rain or shine, I would pick out a new trail on the map and head deep into the woods for the entire day. It didn't take me long to completely adapt to this new lifestyle. Right after moving in, I started hitting the trails and trying to blend in with the locals. At night, I'd grab a bite of eat in town, and I learned pretty quickly that everyone in the area was unexpectedly pleasant. Everyone, except for one guy. I'm referring to a local man named Hector. Now, I should clarify that Hector wasn't mean or rude to anyone. He was just strange, like living on another planet strange. The very first time I met Hector, I was just arriving at work a little after 5 a.m. Out of nowhere, this guy ran straight up to my car window just as I was about to open it. Where I'm from, if someone rushes your car like that in the dark, you instinctively punch them in the face before they can hit you. But things are different out here. I immediately threw my hands up in a defensive position and started yelling at him to back off. Instead of attacking, he just screamed right in my face, turned around, and skipped away. I mean, legitimately skipped like a schoolchild. As I was standing there, completely bewildered and questioning my life choices, one of my co-workers walked up. He chuckled and told me that the guy's name was Hector and that he was completely harmless. Apparently, he had lived in or around the town for a long time, but nobody knew exactly where his home was. Everyone just assumed he was homeless and probably lived under a bridge somewhere. The townspeople just left him alone and let him wander around because he never bothered anyone. Still, having a grown man sprint up and scream in your face at dawn was alarming, to say the least. But if the whole town claimed he was harmless, I figured I'd just roll with it. Over the next few weeks, I started seeing Hector literally everywhere. It didn't matter if I was driving to work at the crack of dawn or leaving a local bar after 11 p.m., I would spot him just wandering the streets. He was a short guy, but he was built like an absolute ox, thick and strong. He couldn't have been taller than 5'3" at most. He was always wearing the exact same outfit, a stained white tank top and royal blue pants that looked somewhere between jeans and sweatpants. He had a long, dirty grey beard, and his hair was pulled back into a greasy ponytail, even though he was completely bald on top. But even with that bizarre appearance, the most noticeable thing about Hector was definitely the skipping. Every single time you saw him moving down the street, he'd be skipping along. His blissful ignorance was almost enviable at times. One morning, while driving to work, I saw Hector standing on a street corner facing the opposite direction of my car. As I approached the intersection, I noticed he was waving frantically to someone. But when I passed through the intersection and got a clear angle, I realized he wasn't waving to anyone at all. He was staring into a blank brick wall, talking to someone, looking incredibly animated and angry, even though the sidewalk was completely empty. I just kept driving and minded my own business. Honestly, it's not that uncommon for someone in Hector's position to talk to themselves, and as long as he wasn't a danger to himself or others, I really couldn't care less what he was doing. The following weekend, I hit the woods on my day off. I spent a few hours hiking through a dense, isolated part of the forest that I hadn't explored yet. While I was miles deep into the wilderness, the absolute silence was broken. I thought I could hear the faint sound of a voice echoing through the trees. Now, hearing any kind of human voice this deep in the backcountry is immediately alarming. Remember, this isn't some well-groomed trail you'd find at a state park. This is pure, unadulterated wilderness. Any voice out here is enough to make the hairs on your arms stand up. I know it sounds sketchy, but I wanted to know the source of the voice. Instead of doing the smart thing and retreating back the way I came, I started to stealthily move toward the sound. As I got closer, I could tell that one of the voices sounded like it was in serious distress. I quietly reached into my pocket, gripped my folding knife just in case, and continued to sneak through the brush as quietly as possible. The voices were coming from just behind a thick grouping of pine trees directly in front of me. I held my breath, carefully peeked around the tree trunk, and my jaw dropped. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. It wasn't multiple people. It was Hector, just Hector, completely alone. He was having a full-blown conversation with himself, but he was frantically switching his voice back and forth. One of the voices was incredibly angry, deep and belittling, calling him a coward, among some other horrific things. Then, like the snap of a finger, he would switch to a totally different high-pitched voice and start weeping, begging for forgiveness. The most terrifying part about it was that each voice sounded like a completely different human being. The range was chilling. I decided right then and there to stay hidden behind the tree. There was no way in hell I was going to step out and engage with a man having a severe psychotic episode in the middle of nowhere. But as I was praying he wouldn't notice me, the angry voice suddenly came back, and without Hector even turning around to look in my direction, he screamed in a distorted, mocking tone, "He's hiding behind the tree. This time you can't let him get away." I watched in absolute horror as Hector snapped his body around and stared directly at me through the branches. For the very first time since I had met him, the goofy, childlike demeanor was gone. There was pure, unadulterated, murderous rage in his eyes. I took a frantic step back from the tree, my brain short-circuiting as I tried to process what was happening. I didn't have long to think because right at that exact moment, Hector charged at me, letting out a blood-curdling scream. He wasn't skipping anymore. He was sprinting on all cylinders, and he was terrifyingly fast. I turned on my heel and ran for my absolute life back toward the direction of the trailhead. For what felt like an eternity, I could hear Hector right on my tail, crashing through the brush.
He kept screaming at the top of his lungs that I was not going to make it out of this forest alive. He would let out this manic, echoing laugh and then go right back to screaming. Every few minutes it sounded like his footsteps were right behind me, like he was inches away from grabbing the back of my shirt. I ran faster than I ever have in my entire life. Eventually, the crashing sounds behind me began to fade, and the woods went dead silent again. When I finally burst through the tree line and reached the clearing where my car was parked, I instantly ducked down behind the hood, gasping for air, scanning the woods. Hector was nowhere to be found. I peeled out of there, drove straight to town and burst into the local police station to report the attack. The sheriff looked at me like I was insane. She almost didn't believe me at first. She simply couldn't visualize harmless old Hector acting with that kind of vicious anger and rage. But when I described the rough coordinates and the specific area of the woods I had been hiking in, the color completely drained from her face. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. For starters, she couldn't believe Hector was even out there, considering it was a grueling several-hour hike into the deep wilderness. But then she told me the most disturbing part. Right around the exact area I was describing, she explained that several years ago they had found the skeletal remains of a local man who had gone missing from town. She told me the discovery had been deeply disturbing and saddening for the entire tight-knit community. The state police never found out who did it, and it remained the only dark, unsolved blemish on an otherwise peaceful town. As I sat there, the sheriff started connecting the dots out loud. She tried to remember exactly when Hector had first started appearing in the town square. She admitted her memory was a bit fuzzy, but she was pretty sure Hector started showing up right around the exact same time they discovered those human remains in the woods. She asked if I could guide her and a deputy back to the location immediately because she wanted to bring Hector in for questioning. At the very least, she needed to know why he had assaulted a hiker and if he was a threat to the community. We basically jogged through the trails back to the site, but by the time we got there, Hector was long gone. Our sheriff, who has since retired, actually got visibly emotional standing there. She confirmed to me that we were standing in almost the exact same spot where they had recovered the body all those years ago. The police launched a search, but they never caught Hector. In fact, nobody in town ever saw him after that day. It's like he just completely vanished into the ether of the forest. I still go out and hike every chance I get. I won't let fear ruin nature for me. But every single time I step beneath the canopy of those trees, I half expect Hector to leap out from the shadows and finish what he started. I never go anywhere without a heavy-duty knife and bear spray on my belt now. Sometimes, the people who look the most harmless on the outside can be harboring the most unfathomable evil on the inside. I have no concrete proof if Hector was responsible for that horrible crime years ago, but after seeing the monster that awoke inside him that day in the woods, it wouldn't surprise me one bit. I remember asking a co-worker later why Hector was never questioned when the body was first found, and nobody could give me a solid answer. Now that I've lived here a while, I realize these small-town departments aren't equipped to handle homicides of that magnitude. There probably wasn't much of a forensic investigation back then. Even writing this out and reliving it now, it still feels completely surreal. My advice to anyone listening to this is always pay attention to your surroundings and never let your guard down. You truly never know what kind of sickness is hiding behind a smile, even someone as seemingly helpless and happy as Hector appeared to be.
The next story. I'm writing this story down right now while it's still fresh in my head, mostly because my hands are still shaking and my mind is completely racing. My girlfriend Katie and I just got back a few hours ago from what was supposed to be a multi-day hiking trip. The main reason I need to get this out there is that I'm still trying to process what the hell actually happened to us. The more I sit here and analyze it, the faster I start spiraling down a rabbit hole of insane thoughts.
3 days ago, we started a long-planned backcountry hike in the mountains of upstate New York. If anyone listening is familiar with that region, you already know just how dense and breathtaking that wilderness is. When people outside of New York State think about New York, they tend to only picture Manhattan, skyscrapers, and bumper-to-bumper traffic. But there is so much more to this state. I would honestly argue that the wilderness up north is some of the most beautiful and deeply underrated nature in the country. Our planned itinerary was supposed to last 4 days and 3 nights. It was a chance for us to unplug, get completely off the grid, and just be alone together in nature. We both love to hike and camp. We've explored forests and mountain ranges all over the US, so this trip wasn't anything out of the ordinary for us. We knew what we were doing. The first day went incredibly smoothly, except for a few passing rain showers. We didn't encounter a single issue. By late afternoon, we found a nice clearing, pitched our tent, ate some freeze-dried meals, and turned in early so we could get a head start on our trek the following morning. Sometime in the dead of night, I abruptly woke up. It took my eyes a second to adjust to the pitch black, but I quickly noticed that Katie was sitting straight up next to me. Even in the dim light, I could tell she looked absolutely terrified, which is completely out of character for her. She's usually the rock in our relationship when we're outdoors. I reached over and whispered, "Hey, are you okay? What's wrong?" She sort of tripped over her words at first, her jaw trembling so hard she couldn't get a sentence out. Finally, she managed to choke out a whisper. She told me that she had been hearing something directly outside the tent, something that completely freaked her out. Initially, my brain tried to rationalize it. I thought it could have easily been a stray animal, like a deer or a raccoon, because they're everywhere up there. But a simple animal wouldn't have caused her to look this profoundly traumatized. I whispered back, "Hold on, I'll take a look." But the moment my hand reached for the metal zipper inside the tent door, Katie let out this sharp, terrified gasp and grabbed my wrist with an iron grip. She looked me dead in the eye and literally begged me not to open it. I paused, my hand still resting on the zipper, just staring at her. Part of me wondered if she had just had a really vivid nightmare and was still stuck in that hazy, half-dream state. While I was sitting there trying to figure out how to calm her down, I watched Katie completely freeze. Her eyes widened, and that's when I heard it too. Outside the tent on the forest floor, I could distinctly hear the heavy crunch of footsteps walking around on the dry leaves. We both sat frozen, holding our breath, listening intently to the footsteps circling our campsite. The way the weight shifted and the rhythm of the crunching made it undeniably clear this was not a four-legged animal. Whoever was outside was walking upright on 2 feet. The stranger just kept slowly pacing a tight perimeter around our nylon tent, and then, every couple of minutes, the person would let out this quiet, high-pitched giggle. It was a soft, childlike, yet deeply twisted laugh. Neither of us had any earthly clue what to do. We didn't carry firearms with us, only our standard hiking knives. I realized that unzipping the tent and confronting a potential lunatic in the pitch black would be suicide. So we made the collective decision to just stay put, keep our mouths shut until dawn, and pray that whoever was out there would eventually get bored and leave. I'm honestly not sure exactly how long she was out there pacing, but after what felt like hours, the sound of her footsteps finally faded into the distance. For the rest of the night, we heard absolutely nothing except the eerie silence of the deep woods. Usually, that peaceful silence is our favorite part of camping, but on that particular night, it had us completely on edge. The second dawn broke, I slowly zipped open the tent and stepped outside. To my immense relief, the campsite looked entirely deserted. I felt a wave of peace wash over me, but it lasted for maybe 5 seconds. As soon as I walked a few feet away from the tent to inspect the perimeter, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were hundreds of strange rocks scattered all over our little campsite. Rocks that I knew with 100% certainty were not there when we went to sleep. Worse, these rocks had been deliberately stacked and arranged into bizarre, deliberate formations surrounding our tent. Katie came outside, took one look at the stone circles, and immediately started packing her gear. She was done. She told me she wanted to hike back to the car right that second. But, idiot that I am, I managed to convince her to keep going with our planned route. The events of the night were horrifying, but my brain was desperate for logic. I argued that it had to be a couple of local teenagers or obnoxious rowdy campers just messing with us to get a reaction. I couldn't come up with any other rational explanation, so I chose the comforting lie. We kept hiking, but the mood was ruined. The entire day, Katie kept constantly looking over her shoulder, completely convinced that we were being followed through the tree line. Every single time she snapped her head back, I would stop, scan the dense brush, and see absolutely nothing but trees. By early afternoon, Katie was mentally exhausted and refused to go any further. I couldn't blame her. We set up our camp early, threw up the tent, and prepared for an uneasy evening. Katie made me swear on my life that we would head back at first light. She said if we woke up at dawn and maintained a jogging pace, we could cover the remaining day and a half of trail and reach the parking lot by nightfall. The whole point of these trips is to enjoy nature, and she was miserable. That night, I was convinced she wouldn't be able to sleep a wink. I was wrong. She must have been completely drained from the adrenaline and anxiety because her head hit the travel pillow and she knocked out instantly. It took me a lot longer to unwind, but eventually the exhaustion started creeping in. Just as I was on the absolute brink of falling asleep, a sound jolted me wide awake. I heard someone whisper.
My heart immediately threw itself against my ribs. I looked over at Katie to see if she had spoken in her sleep, but she was still out like a light, breathing heavily. Then the whisper came again. It was a soft, youthful female voice, and it sounded like it was pressed directly against the nylon wall of the tent right next to my ear. It said, "Come outside, Artie." My blood turned to ice. That voice just said my name. We were miles out in the wilderness, completely isolated, in a park where we hadn't spoken to a single soul. How could anyone out here possibly know my name? Before I could even process the sheer terror of that realization, a second, completely different woman's voice chimed in from the opposite side of the tent. She giggled and said, "Yeah, Artie, please come outside. We're waiting for you." I didn't react. I didn't move a single muscle. I was paralyzed, trying to decide if I should wake Katie up and cause a massive panic, or if I should just sit there in the dark and pray they wouldn't try to come inside. They didn't whisper anymore after that. Suddenly, the quiet night erupted into chaos. I heard multiple sets of footsteps running full speed around the tent. They weren't pacing anymore, they were sprinting in circles. And as they ran, they began to laugh uncontrollably. These high-pitched, chaotic laughs were the most unhinged, sinister sounds I have ever heard in my life. It sounded like a pack of cackling hyenas. During the peak of the laughter, one of the voices suddenly dropped several octaves, becoming incredibly deep, guttural, and masculine, and shouted, "Come outside now." With the deafening voices and the violent activity right outside, Katie jolted awake. She immediately panicked, crying and frantically asking me what the hell was happening. I can't even begin to imagine how disorienting it must have been for her to wake up to absolute madness and screaming right outside her ears.
I didn't even get a chance to explain anything to her because the women outside suddenly started physically messing with the tent. It felt like they were deliberately throwing their body weight into the flexible walls, leaning heavily against the fabric. Then they grabbed the exterior rainfly and structural ropes and yanked them so violently that our entire tent actually slid a few inches across the dirt. Katie was sobbing, holding on to me for dear life. I have to admit, I was completely terrified. This was way beyond a harmless prank. Then, in an instant, the chaos stopped. We heard several heavy footsteps frantically running away, retreating deeper and deeper into the dark woods until the sound bled out completely. Everything went dead silent again. For the next 30 minutes, Katie and I just stared at each other in the dark. Neither of us uttered a single word. We were completely traumatized, having no idea what we had just dealt with or how to survive it if they came back. Once 30 minutes had passed with no further sounds, I decided I couldn't just sit there like a sitting duck anymore. I needed to see if the coast was clear.
I slowly, meticulously unzipped the tent door just a fraction of an inch, while Katie squeezed the absolute life out of my forearm. I peered through the tiny gap into the moonlight. Standing about 20 feet away from our tent was an image that will be permanently burned into my retinas until the day I die. It was a young woman, appearing to be in her early 20s, standing perfectly still in a patch of moonlight. She was wearing a pristine white dress, which was absolutely insane considering we were miles deep into the rough backcountry in the middle of a freezing night. As soon as she caught my eye, she raised her hand and slowly, mechanically waved at me. I slammed the zipper shut, pulled the flap down, and sat there completely speechless. Katie had been looking over my shoulder and saw the silhouette and the dress as well. Her reaction mirrored mine, total catatonic shock. For the rest of the night, we just sat there in the center of the tent, holding each other and shaking. Every second, we expected that woman or her friends to charge the tent and tear through the fabric, but thankfully, nothing else happened. At dawn, I slowly unzipped the tent again. The woman was gone. But just like the previous morning, there were hundreds of rocks scattered across our camp in eerie geometric formations. To make things worse, there were also bundles of thick sticks tied together with dark twine, forming strange cryptic symbols hanging from the low tree branches. Symbols that neither I nor Katie recognized from any book or movie. It looked deeply ritualistic and sinister. We didn't care about packing neatly anymore. We grabbed our essential gear, threw our unfolded tent into a pack, left the rocks and symbols exactly where they lay, and darted out of those woods. We didn't just jog, we practically sprinted the entire distance back. It took us less than a day to cover the ground that should have taken 2. When we finally reached my car, we threw our stuff in the trunk and drove back to our apartment in absolute heavy silence. I told her that as soon as I got home, I was going to write this story down and share it. As much as we used to love the woods, I am in absolutely no hurry to go back anytime soon, and definitely never to those specific woods. I guess the logical, comforting answer is still that a group of incredibly dedicated psychotic locals were messing with us for a sick joke, but I don't know why anyone would go through that much coordination and effort in the middle of the night for a prank. Any other supernatural conclusion I try to come to just makes me question my entire reality. It felt incredibly evil, and honestly, the part that keeps me up at night, the part that makes me think real monsters might actually exist out there, is how the hell did she know my name? The next story. I've thought about sharing this story several times throughout the years, but I've basically been sitting on it for a while. I don't talk about it a lot to people in my day-to-day life.
I guess the main reason I avoid bringing it up is that I honestly struggle to fully articulate or explain what actually happened to us that afternoon. Every time I relive it, I'm just left with this unsettling, empty feeling. Ever since we graduated from high school, my two best friends, Theo and Carlos, and I have maintained a strict tradition. Every single year, no matter where life takes us, we always find a weekend to get together and spend some quality time out in the deep woods. It's a ritual we started over a decade ago, and even though we're all married now with careers and adult responsibilities, we still make it happen. When we were kids, we were completely obsessed with exploring the outdoors. We used to trek through the local patches of woods in the town where we grew up, looking for anything out of the ordinary. Our biggest obsession back then was finding caves. We actually stumbled across our very first cave when we were about 16, and it completely hooked us. As we got older, our expeditions grew larger, and we started traveling further out into the wilderness, actively searching for hidden caverns. That was our thing. But over the years, as we transitioned into our late 20s, our trips became less about intense exploring and more about just maintaining our friendship. Our little expeditions were usually incredibly safe, and the biggest risk we ever realistically faced was just the local wildlife, which, even after all these years, had never actually been an issue for us. Until one specific afternoon. We were miles off the beaten path, cutting through a densely forested valley, when we stumbled across a cabin that was legitimately sitting in the dead center of the woods. Now, we approached this place exactly like every single fool in every horror movie that features a rundown cabin in the woods. We were literally joking and laughing amongst ourselves about how we were walking right into a total horror movie cliché. We walked up to the side and looked through the grime-covered windows, and it was blindingly obvious that the place was completely abandoned. It was almost entirely empty inside, except for a few broken pieces of wooden furniture scattered across the floorboards. Carlos immediately turned to us and said he wanted to go inside and check it out. Neither of Theo or I disagreed. Now, to some people, voluntarily breaking into a creepy abandoned shack in the middle of nowhere might sound like a massive hell no moment, but honestly, for us, it wasn't that weird. We've encountered some incredibly bizarre things in the woods over the years. For example, on one of our earlier trips, we found this massive clearing in the thickest part of the forest that contained a creepy makeshift village. It was filled with small abandoned huts and giant mounds of debris and trash everywhere. It terrified us at first, but we found out later through some local research that it used to be the living quarters for the staff of a traveling circus that had operated in the area way back in the day. So, needless to say, you find weird stuff in the woods all the time. A clearly abandoned cabin was far from anything that would send us running. It was just an unexpected mystery. Getting to the bottom of whatever we found was something we always looked forward to. The moment we stepped inside the cabin, my brain immediately started firing off questions. First of all, why on earth was there a cabin built this deep into the wilderness? I should clarify that it's honestly a bit of a stretch to even call this place a cabin. It was more like a large, oversized shed completely constructed out of rough wood. The entire building consisted of just one big square room. There was no plumbing, no electricity, and absolutely no roads or paths that led to or from it. The air inside felt incredibly dry and heavy, making it almost uncomfortable to breathe. Carlos started picking through some of the shattered pieces of furniture to see if there was anything cool or salvageable, but it was all just rotted garbage. There really wasn't much to investigate, since the whole place was just an empty box. But as the three of us were standing there talking, we suddenly started hearing a very weird sound. We couldn't identify it right away, which was strange given how small the room was. It sounded like something heavy was being dragged across the dirt. It was a rhythmic, scratching, sliding noise, definitely not a typical sound you expect to hear inside a house. And the worst part, the sound was coming from directly under us. Now, from the outside, the cabin clearly didn't have a basement, at least one we could see. So hearing this distinct sound right below our boots was incredibly jarring. I actually dropped down to my knees and pressed my ear directly against the floorboards to listen. And while I was down there, it was unmistakable. There was something moving directly under the floor. I stood up and started frantically kicking the broken furniture and debris out of the way, looking for a hidden latch or a hidden door in the floorboards. Sure enough, in the far left corner of the cabin, buried under a thick layer of rotting wood, we uncovered an iron handle on the ground. It was a hidden trap door. Every logical instinct should have told us to leave, but my curiosity completely overrode my judgment. I grabbed the cold iron handle and lifted the heavy wooden door. The moment the seal broke, an odor blasted out from the darkness underneath that almost made me instantly vomit. It was suffocating. It smelled intensely of rotten, decomposing meat. I quickly reached into my backpack, pulled out a bandana, and wrapped it tightly around my nose and mouth. It didn't fix the problem, but it made the stench barely manageable enough for me to keep standing there. There was a wooden ladder leading down into the pitch black. Before descending, I clicked on my high-powered flashlight and shone the beam downward, trying to see what was making that noise. It was too dark and dusty to get a clear visual, but the dragging sound was getting louder now, and I could say with absolute certainty that it was coming from the center of that underground room. As I climbed down the wooden rungs of the ladder, the very first thing I noticed was how unnaturally cold it was down there. It wasn't just the typical chill of a basement, it was a deep, freezing, oppressive cold that instantly made me shiver. I reached the bottom, planted my boots on the rough stone floor, and swept my flashlight around the dark room. The ground was made of old, uneven stones, and the only structural features were two massive wooden support beams on each side of the room holding up the ceiling. Up at the opening, Carlos and Theo were peering down, frantically whispering, asking if I could see what was making the noise. But before I could even open my mouth to answer them, I got my answer in the worst way possible. Limping out from behind one of the giant wooden pillars was a man. He looked entirely normal at a glance, which somehow made it so much creepier. He was wearing a plain green t-shirt and a pair of blue jeans. He was clean-shaven with messy dark hair, but as soon as he limped past the beam into my flashlight line, a gasp caught in my throat. It startled me so badly that I couldn't even let out a proper scream. The man didn't acknowledge my presence at all. He didn't blink. He just kept slowly limping from the left side of the room to the right side. As he moved, he was heavily dragging his right foot completely flat across the stone floor. That was the exact scratching, dragging sound we had heard from above. The man clearly did not seem well. He was breathing incredibly heavy, his chest heaving up and down. I swallowed the lump in my throat, held the flashlight steady, and shouted to him, asking if he was all right or if he needed help. Up above, I could hear Carlos frantically whispering at me to shut up, telling me we needed to get the hell out of there right now. Theo had actually climbed halfway down the ladder to check on me, but the second he saw the silhouette of the man limping in the dark, he turned right around and scrambled back to the top. I don't blame him at all. After I shouted a few more times asking if he was all right, the man still completely ignored my existence. I took a cautious, incredibly stupid step closer to him, and that's when I noticed he was rapidly mumbling something under his breath. He was speaking very fast, but whatever language he was speaking, it was definitely not English. I'm no linguistics expert, but it sounded totally foreign and erratic. Suddenly, when I was just a few feet away from him, the man abruptly stopped limping. He stood completely, entirely still. His heavy breathing instantly ceased, and the room went dead silent. He slowly turned just his head to look at me. Then he mechanically rotated the rest of his body until he was facing me dead on. After that, he didn't move a single muscle. He just stared at me with these horrible, vacant, completely lifeless eyes. Every single survival instinct in my body screamed at me that I was in immediate danger. I began to slowly, carefully back away, keeping my flashlight trained on his face, moving my boots backward toward the base of the ladder. The entire time I backed up, he didn't blink, he didn't move. But the exact second my hand reached out and gripped the wooden rail of the ladder, the man took one step toward me. It was one single, incredibly aggressive, lunging step, and then he snapped back into perfect stillness. That was my breaking point. Everything about the situation felt profoundly wrong and malevolent. I scrambled up that wooden ladder as fast as my limbs could possibly carry me, nearly knocking Carlos over as I burst through the trapdoor opening. I screamed at them that we needed to leave now. Whoever was down there was unhinged, and I was entirely convinced he was dangerous. Before slamming the heavy trapdoor shut, the three of us cast one final glance down into the dark. Standing right at the absolute base of the ladder, staring directly up into our faces, was the man. He wasn't moving, but he had one pale hand firmly gripped on to the bottom rung of the ladder, as if he was contemplating climbing up after us. Those dead eyes staring up through the floorboards will haunt me forever. We slammed the door, bolted out of that cabin, and ran through the woods without looking back. We just kept running until we finally hit the clearing where our vehicles were parked. Once we got to safety, my mind started playing devil's advocate. I remember thinking that maybe that guy was actually in serious trouble, injured or lost, and we had just abandoned him like cowards. But that guilt didn't last long. I can't fully articulate it, but the atmosphere in that room felt entirely predatory. We drove straight to the local authorities and reported the hidden bunker, the cabin, and the strange man to the police, just in case he was a missing person or a squatter in psychological distress. A few days later, we followed up. From what the deputies told us, they did locate and investigate the cabin, and they even went down into the underground room, but they found absolutely nobody down there. In fact, they claimed there wasn't a single shred of physical evidence to suggest that anyone had ever been living or staying in that cabin recently. They checked all the local and state missing persons reports to see if anyone matched the description I gave them, but it was a total dead end. Even the police couldn't give us a straight answer as to why that hidden stone room was built under a shack so far out in the middle of nowhere. To this day, I have no concrete idea what we actually stumbled across that afternoon. Part of me wants to rationalize it and think we just made a mistake, that maybe we just accidentally broke into some eccentric local's private property and we're the bad guys in his story. But deep down, I know that's not true. No normal human being acts the way that man did in pitch-black darkness next to the smell of rotting meat. As much as a curious part of me would love to know what his true intentions were, I am incredibly grateful that we made it out of that basement in time to never find out. My gut tells me we came face to face with something purely evil that day, even if my rational brain tries to tell me that's impossible. The three of us still get together every single year to hike and camp, but trust me, we are 1,000,000 times more careful now. and I made a solemn promise to myself that afternoon. If we ever stumble across another abandoned cabin in the middle of the woods, I'm not looking inside. I'm going to turn right around and run as fast as I can in the opposite direction.